In 1977, American designers Charles and Ray Eames made Powers of 10, a film that took us, with great scientific accuracy, not only into the far reaches of space, but to the limits of our understanding. It was the same year that George Lucas did pretty much the same thing, only replacing realism with romance. Since the beginning of movies, we've been blurring the line between scientific developments and imaginative dreams, often without knowing where it will lead, retelling old fables that keep the generations in check. And it can all be traced back, through movie DNA, to the first science fiction film ever made, when, in 1902, another man named George took us on a trip to the moon. And 67 years later, we did it again. Only this time as seen through the lens of fuzzy black and white. It's no wonder then that we prefer to do our dreaming in Technicolor. But don't let the narrative fool you. Science fiction is not the journey to leave footprints on distant planets, but rather in the bleak moments that we realize we've gone too far, where we feel ourselves drifting further away from where we came from. And while watching people spin out of control in dark underground laboratories, we forget that we too share the same obsessive desires to live in the shadows, experimenting with the unknown and exploring the mysteries of our minds. We are the scientists that struggle to affirm our own existence and daydream the impossible in between commercials for Coca-Cola and BMWs. In this episode, we'll be looking at Altered States, a film that confused critics and angered its very creator with excessive hallucinogenic sequences and its heart-on-sleeve direction. Released on Christmas Day in 1980, the film sits in between the iconoclast filmmakers that shook up the 70s and the more commercially minded movies of the 80s. What we have as a result is a film as equally fragmented as our scientist in question. The film opens on Eddie Jessup, a Harvard research scientist already deep, quite literally, into his next experiment. After a study on schizophrenia, he branches off further into the unknown with the help of psychedelic drugs while floating inside a water isolation tank. His goal is seemingly straightforward, that while depriving himself of all of his physical senses, hopes to heighten brain activity to see firsthand whether there are other tangible states of mind, just as real as everyday life. And with this being a Ken Russell film, you can pretty much guarantee that the camera won't remain this objective for long, much to the annoyance of writer Paddy Chayefsky, who hated his direction so much he refused to be credited. But there's much to admire about the film, least of all for showing us the worryingly thin line between the logical and hysterical.
How do you feel?
Not bad. I hallucinated like a son of a bitch. A variety of dream states, mystical states. A lot of religious allegory, mostly out of Revelation.
You were in there close to 5 hours.
It felt like an hour.
I'd like to try that myself sometime.
You should, you'll like it.
On first impressions, the styles of Paddy Chayefsky and Ken Russell couldn't be further apart. Chayefsky preferring to work with directors whose minimal approaches magnify his own writing, giving center stage to complex characters who daringly chip away at American ideals with pent-up frustration for hypocrisy. It's subversive for sure, but not to the point of turning off those that need to listen. Ken Russell, however, is not for subtle tastes, often scrapping dialogue altogether for the more visceral experience. Putting style aside, they had clear common ground. They both confronted institutions that slowly exert themselves into places traditionally reserved by religion, biting down hard with sharp satire, and focused on the change of values in front of our very eyes. Enter then the clear analogy of a godless universe, the big dark void as it were, and we see that the question isn't so much what happens to religion, but rather what we replace it with. In an early scene, we hear the sound of church bells competing for attention over the more excitable conversation of sex and science, and the message is clear that for better or for worse, religion takes a back seat.
So significant in schizophrenia. There's only so much work you can do with animals. I worked with monkeys for 2 years, but monkeys can't tell you what's going on inside their consciousness. You need human beings for that. And you're not allowed to ablate human beings, and you can't stick electrodes in their skull, so I have to use some kind of trance-inducing technique, and the isolation tank seemed the least risky.
Jessup is a man still scarred by the death of his father, who lived a good life and despite being a faithful person, in the end suffered like everybody else. And it is with this revelation that Jessup leaves behind conventional religion to find a greater truth behind the cosmic curtains of our seemingly pointless existence. What he begins to find, however, far away from recording monitors, are not the visions of an alternate destiny, but something dangerously closer to home. With an even bigger isolation tank and heavier, untested drugs, Jessup starts what is to become a trip of a lifetime when he begins to awaken genes that have laid dormant within his DNA, passed down through millions of years of evolution. In his desperate drive to leave the body behind, he begins recalling ancestors and primitive memories without context, and it is at precisely this moment that the film appropriately begins to fall apart. And as we fall into the black hole for ourselves, we fail to encode it too. On the next episode, we'll be looking over patriotic values with suspicious eyes as we knock on the doors to those who don't conform in Joe Dante's The Burbs.